Book 8, The Last Day, Chapter 6, The 35th Day of Planting, Part 4 of 5. Shem finally moved. He hadn't had anything to eat or drink all day, but now at dinner time he finally looked away from the wooden grave marker and beckoned to his assistant, who had kept a constant vigil by his side. The man squatted next to him. "Yes, guide?" "Chorik, you're in charge now," Shem whispered. "You've served the next longest. You'll need another assistant, probably two, until we hear back on what happened to Ano. Under different circumstances, I'd recommend Pedo Shin as a new assistant, but he's needed by his family right now. Find other solid men of faith, make your selection, pray about your decisions, then tell the other assistants to come here. I'll formally grant you the power of guide. It's only until the deliverer comes anyway." Chorik sat by Shem and put a brotherly arm around him. "Don't worry about the deliverer just yet. And handing over being a guide, that's never been done before, Guide Zenas. The Creator established his successor procedure with Guide Hiram, and there's no successor for you until you die." Shem stared at the grave marker. "I am dead. He just forgot to shut down my body." Chorik squeezed him. "The Creator forgets nothing, Guide." "I'm not worthy of that title," he whispered. "Obviously you are, because you're still here, Shem." His shoulders began to heave. "You're still Guide, Shem. The Creator has chosen you to do great things, including defending your people with the sword and distracting the army to give our people more time. The scouts estimated that 1/3 of the army has now abandoned Thorn, just as the prophecy said. 2 lives were lost, but thousands more were saved because of you. I knew both Mari and Kala," Chorik continued. "They would readily give up their lives to make sure others lived. Mari knew exactly what she was doing at the temple, I'm sure of it. Kala chose to follow you here. No one forced either of those women. It was the Creator who took them, Shem, not you. You were merely an instrument for him to work through, as you always have been, as you must continue to be. I'll continue to direct the others while you are indisposed, but I'm not the guide. You are, Shem Zenas. I know it with all that I am." Chorik embraced the guide, who sat unresponsive, then stood up and took his position again, standing by his side. "Not too bad," young Pear said, as Versa pointed out another hashed tree in the distance. "You've spotted all 5 so far." "It's rather fun," she smiled with another cringe young Pear couldn't see. She pressed her lips together tightly and took long, quiet, deep breaths deliberately through her nose, counting as she walked. The reports came in sporadically all day at the ancient site. Pedo was able to join the assistants occasionally to get updates, but all he could do was acknowledge the news with a weak nod. When he returned to the families trying to buoy each other up, he wondered why he bothered to do anything that day. The reports delivered by Woodson scouts leaving the valley were grim. Thousands of Salemites had been killed, including women and children, their corpses strewn in the farms and lands where they fell. Hundreds were taken prisoner and questioned, tied up and under armed guard. A couple thousand were still trying to escape, taking the southern Idamia trail. Some soldiers sitting near the canyon, with a newly acquired taste for blood, massacred many. A few escaped and were on their way to the ancient site. There were a couple hundred from Eltana's failed army, attempting to take the lower middle route by the estates, and a few others had made it even further north to the upper middle route. They'd seen the devastation of the army of Idamia and had finally come to their senses, running away only minutes before soldiers invaded their homes. Houses were looted, animals were slaughtered, storehouses were raided, Salem was being ravaged, and Pedo was helpless. At dinner, Cephas Brighter joined his uncle in receiving updates. "We have to help," he insisted. "We need to go down and—" "Become targets ourselves?" Pedo said. "Too risky, Cephas." "I'll do it, Uncle Pedo. I volunteer—" "No," Pedo shouted. with the most energy he'd felt all day. No more death for this family. No one goes down. We wait and we watch, but they delayed their coming to us. We can only pray for them now. Let me find young Pear then, Cephas begged. I might be able to. Pato closed his eyes, feeling as if the day would shove him into the ground like a tent stake. We wait and we watch, he repeated drearily. But he delayed his coming to us. We can only pray for him now. Go sit with your mother. She doesn't need to mourn for another person, Cephas. John, Ophrah, and Timon waved farewell to the tail end of the Idumeans heading back to the world. By the time their group had reached the glacial fort, the ranks of retreaters had swollen to over 5,000. Women and children, some who had just barely arrived, were following them back too, after hearing the horror stories about the demise of Guide Leonard and the shocking appearance and subsequent death of Mrs. Shin. While John and Timon were heartened to see so many come to their senses and leave before the last day, they were equally discouraged to see how many more from the world were still intent on invading Salem. They didn't believe the reports, even as retreating soldiers shouted at them to turn around, because they wouldn't believe anything except their own desires. John had also tried to dissuade them, but Timon held him back. If they don't want to listen, no words you say will change their minds. Let's help these back to the world instead. We can save only those who want to be saved. They went no further than the glacial fort, John possessed with the odd feeling that Perrin's jacket didn't want to get any closer to the world. He obeyed it. They gave clear instructions to those heading down the mountain and shook the hands of hundreds of grateful and trembling soldiers. John sighed and glanced at the sky. Getting dark soon. Not sure if we have time to find any more stragglers. I don't think we have time for anything else, Timon agreed, his voice so filled with such finality that John looked down at him. What do you mean? It's time, Timon said heavily. The end of everything. We've done all that we possibly can. Now it's time for us to head back. Back? Where? The site, John, the ancient site. It's going to be happening very soon. I feel it, and we need to get to safety. John sagged onto a felled log. Timon, he said in a small voice, can I confess something? It was the first time in days that Timon had heard his dull, childlike tone. That aspect of him had been gone for a while, but apparently it had just been hiding behind the colonel. I'm scared. What if I haven't done enough? What if the Creator says I'm not ready? What if I'm not allowed to be there? Timon dropped to his knees and took John's face as if he were 7 years old. John, do you want to serve the Creator? What does your heart want? To be good enough, he whispered, but I'm not yet. Timon shook his head rapidly. You don't need to be. That's the glorious part. The Creator asks only for our hearts to be willing to try, and He'll do all the rest. None of us are good enough, whatever we think that means. His entire purpose is to get us the rest of the way there. Everything you've done these past many days, many weeks, have demonstrated your desire to help and serve. John, you're as good as you can be, and that's good enough. John smiled tenuously, hopefully. Then it grew stronger, and something passed across his face that Timon knew meant another aspect of him had shifted. For some reason, I believe you. Maybe it's just hope that makes me believe you, and strangely, I think that may be enough. I have an idea. There's really only one way from here to get to the ancient site, right? The Idumean Trail? Timon released John's face. You mean the trail which the army of Idumea will take? John waggled his eyebrows. That's the very one. We have time to do one more thing, right? And that would be? Join the army. Nelt, are you sure he went in here? Beavid asked, eyeing the dense woods. Positive. Here, look at this. Nelt tried to raise his arm, but it was too swollen. There hadn't been any bloodshed, but there was a great deal of bruising that occurred before Hammer and Iron finally agreed Nelt wasn't armed. And if he was, he would struggle mightily to retrieve his weapon. Nelt nodded instead to bear claw marks on the trees. "Very aggressive animals around here," Teach said nervously. "Those bear scratches are rather deep." "They are," Nelt agreed. "A little too deep and even. I once saw a bear at the edge of the trees beyond sand scratching a tree. This looks a lot like bear markings, but not entirely. It's a human-made code. Look at the tree over there," he said, cocking his head to it, and immediately regretting the action as his neck muscles ached. The two blacksmiths had been very thorough in their search. "The markings roughly match this one on the tree. I saw Shin and the woman rush over here, and this was the way they came, between these marked trees." "What does the code mean?" Buddy wondered. Nelt shrugged, catching himself just before he caused himself more injury. "I can't decipher it, and I don't think we have time to figure it out. But I know a little about tracking. We can follow them, I'm sure." Beavid sighed. "Might as well let you try." Versa hadn't noticed anything out of the ordinary, but young Pear did. He stepped up and caught her by the shoulder. "Quiet!" He pulled her to a stop. She heard the noise, too. Someone was behind a boulder ahead on the trail, about 20 paces. Without a word, young Pear patted Versa's hip until he found the long knife. Her face flushed as his hand pushed past her coat and slipped under her tunic to grasp the handle. Then he slowly slid the knife out as Versa held her breath. His grip on her shoulder tightened as he held the knife up in the direction of the boulder. "Show yourself!" he demanded. "Let her go!" cried a young voice from behind the stony shield. "Let her go, or I'll hit you with a rock." Young Pear frowned. "How old are you?" "Let her go!" Versa pulled young Pear's hand off her shoulder. "I'm not his prisoner. He's my companion. Do you need help?" The voice behind the boulder went silent. Young Pear lowered the knife. "Are you trying to reach the ancient temple?" "Yes," whimpered a frightened voice. Versa went to take her knife back from young Pear, but he slipped it into his waistband instead. Ignoring her attempt to retrieve it, he strode to the boulder, Versa following close behind. Behind the rock they found a boy of about 12 and a girl maybe 14, cowering together, each holding a jagged rock as a crude weapon. Warily they stood up, eyeing young Pear. The girl squinted her dark brown eyes and tipped her head. "Wait, aren't you one of Rector Shin's sons?" Young Pear admitted, a bit reluctantly, "I am. Do I know you?" "We're the Rescatars!" She nodded eagerly and elbowed her brother. "Luis, we know him!" Turning back to young Pear, who had no idea who the Rescatars were, she said, "We live near the Travados in Norden, east of your grandmother's house. I saw you a few times when you came up to visit." Young Pear nodded as if the girl looked familiar. Knowing enough about females, he said, "Well, you've certainly grown up. I didn't recognize you as such a young woman." She beamed, and young Pear thought he heard Versa scoff quietly behind him. That's when he remembered he'd told Versa his How to Make Girls Swoon in 5 Easy Steps, and had just demonstrated step number 1, vague flattery with a flirtatious smile. He'd tell Versa later that he was just trying to put the trembling girl at ease, really. "Why are you taking this route?" he asked Miss Rescatar. "You should have taken the Norden route. Where are your parents?" The boy Luis squirmed, and the girl said, "They're hurt. We're down here because my papa wanted to try to convince his brother to join us. He didn't want to go to the ancient site and wanted to defend his house instead." Her voice quavered. "He didn't believe Guide seen us, and now it's too late. Mama told Papa we had to leave when the soldiers were coming, and we did, just before they went into my uncle's house. We were watching from the forest. We saw them drag my uncle, and—" She stopped, unable to continue. Versa put a comforting arm around her, and she rested her head on Versa's shoulder. "You said your parents are hurt?" Versa asked kindly. "What happened? Where are they?" "Back there in a clearing," Luis answered, his chin trembling angrily. Some of the soldiers came running into the forest looking for food. We had some and gave it to them, and then they still pushed down Mama and cut Papa." His eyes were hard and bitter. "We gave them everything we had, and still they were mean." Salemites knew nothing of unfairness, young Pear thought, not to mention mindless brutality. "They can't go on," Louise said. "They wanted us to go, but Phoebe and I—" and he too lost his voice. Young Pear rubbed his forehead. "You can fix this, young Pear. You can get them there. It may not be tonight, but you still have time." Young Pear looked to Versa, mostly worried about her, but she was already glaring at him with an expression that said, "Don't you dare think about not helping them." "Take us to your parents," young Pear said to Phoebe. She smiled in gratitude and took off past the trail and down a small ravine, her brother close behind. Versa held her belly as she tried to keep up with their excited pace, and young Pear followed closely, hoping to catch her if she stumbled. About 30 paces off the path, they saw a slight movement behind several felled trees. "Mama! Papa! We found help!" Louise called. "No!" came a cry from behind the logs. "We told you to leave." "Well, we're not obeying," Phoebe said as she bounded to them. "Ah, the evil influence of the world is already here," Versa muttered, "teaching teenage girls to disobey their parents." Young Pear sucked in his breath when he saw 2 more boys come out of hiding by the logs. One looked to be about 9, the other around 8. They each held sticks they probably thought would be effective, and stared in fright at young Pear's inside-out jacket and uniform pants. "It's all right," he assured them as he walked to the other side of the logs. "I'm not with the army anymore. Where are your parents?" But already he saw them. Versa gasped when she joined him. Huddled next to each other in the dried leaves were their mother and father. Mrs. Rescatar had a growing black eye and an obviously broken arm. Mr. Rescatar, lying next to her, was drenched in blood from several stab wounds to his torso. "Oh, I shouldn't have quit taking medical classes," young Pear muttered as he knelt beside them. But Mrs. Rescatar, who looked vaguely familiar, stared in surprise. No, it can't be, can it? Are you young Pear and Shin?" He gave her a dismal smile as he examined her broken arm. "Yes, I am, Mrs. Rescatar. Normally I'd say, 'Good to see you too,' but that doesn't seem appropriate right now." Realizing he'd have to fashion some kind of splint for her arm, he turned his attention next to Mr. Rescatar, who he remembered chatting with his father and grandfather a few times. "Young Pear," Mr. Rescatar said raspily, "you are an answer to prayer. You know that?" He gingerly unbuttoned Mr. Rescatar's reddening shirt. "Now I'm wondering just what kind of a prayer you offered that would bring someone like me to you. Versa," he called over his shoulder, "give me some of those cloth wrappings you had in your bag. I need to see what we're dealing with." Versa, her hand over her mouth in horror, took the pack off young Pear's shoulder. "You should go to the emergency shelter and get the medical kit," Mrs. Rescatar said to young Pear. "The children tried once, but they became too frightened to go alone." Young Pear frowned apologetically. "We never had an emergency shelter on this trail." Mr. Rescatar caught his hand. "Yes, there is," he whispered. "I know. We stocked it 1.5 years ago. That's why I knew we could do the back door, because we did it then." Young Pear sat back on his heels. "There's a shelter here? Since when?" "Since you left." Young Pear closed his eyes briefly, unsure of how to interpret that answer. "But we never put medical kits in them." "Yes, we did," Mrs. Rescatar said. "Every shelter now has a medical bag and supplies." It was the sudden rush of protection, the feeling of being surrounded by help that startled him. But only for a moment, because there was work to do. "Then I better go find it," he decided. "Versa, stay here and start wiping the blood so I can see his wounds. Mrs. Rescatar, can your oldest son help me find the emergency site?" Luis was already nodding. "Then let's go, Luis," young Pear said, pulling out Versa's knife for protection. Is it on the trail? Yep, come on. And Louise started back up the ravine. Young Pear put a hand on Versa's shoulder. You all right for a few minutes if I leave? Versa nodded, a cloth in her hand as she bit her lip, unsure of where to start on Mr. Rescatar. Of course I am. Go, but please be careful, Young Pear. Don't worry about me. I'm maturing every minute. He gave her a quick wink and turned to follow Louise, who was already back up the trail. Mrs. Rescatar noticed that Versa's gaze followed him, even after he'd vanished from view. He does seem to be maturing, Mrs. Rescatar said, as Versa met her eyes. I remember him from a few years ago, and I remember the many stories his grandmother told me about his exploits. I can tell that's not the same boy. Man, she amended. Versa went pink. No, he's not at all. She cleared her throat and tried to suppress a smile. Well, Mr. Rescatar, you have my sympathies. I'm not known for my tenderness, but I'm the one holding a wiping cloth, so... Back up on the trail, Louise soon found the route, and Young Pear followed. They ran another 500 paces or so to where an outcropping of rock hugged a slope in the forest. Over here, Louise called, and darted to the side of it. Young Pear grinned as he noticed the beaver-chewed logs no beaver ever chewed, pointing in the correct direction. He had never noticed the outcropping of rock before on their other trips, and wondered how long it had been there. The boy vanished into a slit in the rock, and Young Pear followed. Inside, he smiled at the collection of crates of food. We should take some food with us, he said to Louise. I don't think we'll be making it to the site tonight. Louise opened the crate closest to him. He grabbed a large empty bag off the top of another crate and started filling it with small wooden boxes labeled jerky, dried fruits, nuts, crackers. Young Pear, looking for the medical kit, paused to watch him. Since when did we start stocking these with leather bags? Since the last time we filled the emergency caves, Louise said casually. Just in case someone needed to carry a lot of things to someone else. Makes sense. Young Pear found another bag next to what he was looking for. Ah, the kit. And it's a big one, too. He inspected the kit and pulled out the first item on top, a large brown bottle. Oh, Pugga, Boscos, he whispered as he stared at the label. The numbing agent. Boss, I'm not sure I can do this. So why did you practice on me? Don't you think there's a reason for everything? Besides, your stitches didn't bother me as much as Boscos did. You did a good job. It just wasn't meant to be. Young Pear smiled briefly, shoved the bottle back into the bag, and slung it over his shoulder. Now, he looked around the tightly packed cave and asked, did anyone happen to stock net litters? Knowing full well the answer was no. Like those? Louise said, pausing in his rush to pack food and pointing to a tangle of nets by the entrance. Since when did... Young Pear pulled one off the natural knob of the stone, but the second one behind it was tangled with it. Young Pear tried to pull them apart, then decided to shove them both into the bag. Versa and Phoebe would need something to occupy them, while Young Pear tried to do something he did only once and nearly 2 years ago. Young Pear nudged Louise, who was trying to shove one more box of elk jerky into the bulging bag. I think you have enough. I know that 12-year-old boys can eat forever, but we'll never eat all of that. We need to get back to your parents before it's dark. Louise nodded, gave the jerky one more shove, and tied the remaining ends of the bag together. He and Young Pear started to slip out of the cave when Young Pear's foot kicked something. Now, I know we didn't stock pots in these things, he declared. What's the point? Louise shrugged. All I remember is that it was with the crates when we were loading the wagon at the storehouse. They said to just take it. Young Pear scoffed at it, then thought again. Actually, this would be good if we could find a source of water. We can heat up some water to properly clean your father's wounds. He put the heavy iron pot on Louise's head like a hat. There you go. Bring it back to him. We already found water, Louise said, sagging a little and peeking out from the rim that sat just above his eyes. "That's why we dragged Papa to the logs. There's a spring down there." It was just too much, young Pear thought. If only he could have had a medical assistant, or better yet, Dr. Toon float down from the treetops to take over, it would have been perfect. Except for, "I can think of only a few more things we might need," he told Louise. "And I have a feeling somehow those will come to us as well." They jogged back down the route to the large boulder. Along the way, young Pear tried to remember how to do the stitches and what he should do if he noticed damage deeper in Mr. Rescatar's body. In the pack there was also a bottle of pain tea. Should he give it to Mr. Rescatar before or after? Then he thought of the times he had a broken arm set, and wished now he'd watched more closely instead of letting his mother cover his eyes. He jogged, trying to envision procedures from the other side of the wounds, until a voice came seemingly out of nowhere. "And where do you think you're going?" It was a soldier with his sword drawn. Young Pear stopped in amazement, but Louise panicked. "Run!" he screamed. Another soldier appeared from behind a tree and caught him. Louise thrashed violently, but ineffectively, as the brawny blond man held him tight. "No, no, no," young Pear said. "It's all right, I think. Hammer, put him down." "Gladly," Hammer said, dropping the kicking boy. Louise pushed the pot back on his head and gazed nervously up at the massive man who had captured him. Young Pear looked over at Iron, who sheathed his sword and grinned at him. "How many of you are there?" "Enough," Buddy said, coming out from behind a tree with a smile of relief on his face. "Am I glad to see you. The forest still makes me nervous." From up in a stand of trees, a voice came down to them. "Told you he was coming. I could see him a mile off." Snarl dropped from the tree. "Even though I wasn't a mile away?" young Pear asked. "So why are you all here?" "Because we believe in you," Sergeant Beavid said, coming up the trail to shake young Pear's hand. "I'm sorry about your grandmother. That wasn't right. None of us want to be a part of this anymore. You've been right about everything. We're yours to command." Young Pear nodded. "Thank you, but I won't be commanding anyone, just giving suggestions. And I can use your help. We've got injured just down there." "I know," Beavid said, gesturing to the ravine. The men and Louise began to walk down into it. "Teach, Reg, Pal, and—" That's as far as Beavid got. Young Pear's eyes flashed in fury when he saw Nelt walking up to meet them. "You!" "No, wait!" Nelt cried as he held up his hands, but young Pear was already charging at him. He tackled him into a pile of wet leaves, and Nelt landed with a grunt. Before young Pear could punch him in the face, Reg was pulling him off. "You don't understand who he is," young Pear said, thrashing. "This is a spy and an assassin, we know," Beavid said, running down to them. "Take a good look at him, Shin. Tell me, doesn't he look roughed up already?" Panting, young Pear looked at the former Cloud Man. He was holding his arms at odd angles, as if in pain. His dark skin was bruised, and an eye was partially swollen shut. "Young Pear," he said between anxious breaths, "if Hammer and Iron offer to give you a full body massage, I wouldn't recommend it. I'm here to apologize and to offer my services. I'm completely unarmed. I'm sorry about deceiving you, but I did it to save your life, remember? Thorn would have killed you at the temple, and you know it. Now, save mine?" Young Pear wanted to feel anger, but he couldn't find it. It wasn't anywhere in him. Part of him actually wanted to forgive Cloudman. He had kept him quite entertained. Young Pear nodded reluctantly. "But I'm watching you every moment." "You and everyone else," Nelt smiled tightly. "Thanks." Young Pear offered a hand to Nelt. He got up with considerable grunting, and Hammer and Iron exchanged satisfied looks. "What's with the jacket?" Nelt asked young Pear. "It's inside out, and I recommend you do the same. The Salemites on the mountain will recognize it as a sign of rejecting the army." He nodded to the rest of the security team, that appeared from behind the fallen logs. Pal and Teach smiled when they saw him. Versa came out from behind a tree and sighed in relief. He walked over to her, feeling guilty for having left her so exposed, and suppressed the urge to embrace her in apology. Instead, he patted her shoulder in a brotherly way. "Sorry if they startled you. Are you all right?" She nodded and patted him back just as awkwardly. "They arrived shortly after you left. They said they knew you. I felt I could trust them, but I wasn't sure." "This is my security team that I told you about," he said in an undertone. "I can trust them about as much as anyone. They're mostly good men. But," he added in a whisper, "I'll keep an eye out for them." Versa smiled. Young Pear felt his chest constrict, and he had to turn away. "Is she a relative?" Beavid asked, nodding to Versa. Young Pear thought quickly. Yeah, a distant sister. I mean, cousin. Cousin Versa Travato." He wrapped an arm around her clumsily and pulled her close. Versa waved just as uncomfortably. "Hi. Surprised to find him, as you might imagine, but so glad I did." She patted his chest in what she likely thought seemed a familiar way. Beavid squinted suspiciously at each of them. "Yeah," Young Pear smiled nervously. "What are the odds? Well, my little friend here," he said, releasing Versa and gesturing to Luis in order to change the subject, "has something in his pack that ought to interest all of you." Luis looked anxiously at the soldiers surrounding him and took the bag that was slung over his shoulder. He opened it up and dumped the boxes on the ground. The security team shouted in surprise as they read the labels and dove at the boxes like starved dogs around a discarded bone. "Dried apples!" Teach exclaimed as he opened one of the small crates. "And peaches, raisins, nuts, crackers, and this," Young Pear picked up a box full of dark strips, "is jerky, Teach. Wapiti or elk jerky." Teach, now on his knees, grabbing at items as quickly as he could with the rest of the security team, looked up into Young Pear's eyes. He took one of the strips of jerky Young Pear held out. "I believe you, Young Pear," he said reverently. "We saw Wapiti. I believe you about everything." "Me foo," Red garbled, with a mouthful of walnuts. He gestured to Young Pear, who grinned and handed him a big strip of jerky. "I'm assuming he said me too," Beavid said, as he took the box out of Young Pear's hands to distribute to the other soldiers. "I think we're all believers right now." Luis looked accusingly at Young Pear as he saw the men clawing open the crates. "And you thought we had too much." Young Pear chuckled. "Keep them under control, soldier, while I get to work on your father." The boy saluted with the wrong hand, and Young Pear winked. His two younger brothers peeked through the logs at the ravenous men and scrunched just a little lower. Behind the logs, Young Pear knelt by Mr. Rescatar and waved over their daughter. "Take the pot your brother brought and fill it with water, please. Bring it back to me so I can start washing off this blood." Phoebe nodded and rushed over to the spring that bubbled nearby. "Versa," Young Pear called to her, "ask Beavid to build a small fire. I'd feel better about heating some water to clean these wounds properly. We don't need infections settling in." Versa nodded and went to speak to Beavid, while Young Pear quickly emptied the medical kit and laid everything out neatly on the cloth on the ground. "So," Mrs. Rescatar began, understandably nervous, "you know what to do with all of this?" She eyed the supplies. "Most of them, yes." He picked up a roll of thick cloths, took one off, and dipped a corner in the pot of water the girl had just placed in front of him. "Get some more cloth and help me wipe up your father. Get it wet first. That's right." "We wouldn't let her work on him, Versa," Mrs. Rescatar explained, as Young Pear began to wipe the dried blood. "We didn't want her using the changing cloths for this." Young Pear looked up from his work on Mr. Rescatar's belly. "The what?" "The new changing cloths. From the looks of things, she'll be needing those in the next few days, and we didn't want her putting them on the baby, still stained with blood." Young Pear swallowed hard and continued to wipe around a stab wound. That one would take only 4 stitches. "Changing cloths," he whispered. remembering how all the food was wrapped in thick beige and gray cloth. He hadn't recognized the cloth or remembered what it was traditionally used for. The strings used to secure the changing cloth around the baby's middle should have been the giveaway. Versa came over to check on his progress. "They're starting a fire right now, young pair. Is that the pot you need heated up?" Young pair looked up and evaluated her critically. "Yes, in a moment. We'll be done wiping here soon. Then we can start heating the water. How are you doing, anyway?" Her smile was immediate and eager, which concerned him. "I'm fine. Do you need anything to eat? There's plenty. I just gave some rations to the little boys." "No, not right now. But Versa, if you—" He nodded to her belly. She cocked her head at him inquisitively. Deciding that she didn't seem to be in any kind of pain or distress, young pair went back to cleaning. Deciding that she didn't seem to be in any kind of pain or distress, young pair went back to cleaning. Versa watched him work for a moment, shuddered, and made her way back to the fire. "Mr. Rescatar, from what I can see you have 4 stab wounds," young pair said, gently wiping his torso with his daughter. "Does that seem right?" He nodded slowly. "That's what I remember. How bad do you think it is?" "Actually, I think it's not as bad as it appears," he said, gingerly cutting away Mr. Rescatar's shirt. "2 stabs seem to have hit the region of your liver. That's why there's so much blood. The 3rd cut isn't very deep, and the 4th, well, it goes in about an inch, and I'm not really sure what's in that area. I didn't get that far in my anatomy class. Whatever's below the liver, I guess," he said lamely. Mrs. Rescatar smiled worriedly at his dismal diagnostic attempts. "So what do we do for him?" "I can stitch him up. I've done it before, and I have the right brown stuff to numb the flesh, and pain tea for later." "Brown stuff?" she asked. "A numbing agent," he remembered the name. "My favorite bottle in the medical bags. After that, we let him rest. But, Mrs. Rescatar, while we wait for the water to boil, I should take care of you." He handed the pot to their daughter and nodded for her to get more water in it. Mrs. Rescatar closed her eyes. "That's what I was afraid of. Can't you just wrap my arm or something?" "I've been thinking about that, and no. I feel distinctly that we should try to set it. From experience, I know that it'll actually hurt less once it's set and secured. But I promise we'll give it only one try, all right? And there's plenty of pain tea." Mrs. Rescatar sighed. "I know you're right." Her voice quavered. "I just don't like the idea." "To be honest," he said, pulling out a long bandage, "I don't either." Realizing that his complete honesty probably wasn't too comforting at that moment, he busied himself picking up several sticks. He crouched next to her, measuring the sticks against her arm until he found 3 that were similar in length. "Why don't you lie down, Mrs. Rescatar? You're losing color. Mrs. Rescatar, uh-oh." She slumped, unconscious, against the log. "Now's your chance," Mr. Rescatar whispered urgently. "Do it quick, young pair. She'll be out only for a minute. Broken bones always make her faint." Young pair said a silent prayer that consisted of, "Help me not to mess this up," took her arm, and with a quick yank and twist, lined up the bones relatively straight. He blinked in amazement that it worked, laid the sticks around her arm as braces, and was just starting to wrap it when Mrs. Rescatar began to stir. "Just do it," she whispered. "Just do it." Young pair grinned as he tied the band, securing the sticks to her arm. "Already did, Mrs. Rescatar, and I didn't even have to plank you." "Plank me?" Young pair chuckled as he continued to wrap and tie her arm, pleased with his success. "I can't wait to see Bosco's face when—" He stopped and gulped, thinking about seeing his cousin later. He finished in silence, staying focused on the tasks at hand. After he helped Mrs. Rescatar lie down more comfortably on the ground, he fashioned her a sling out of another bandage. Then he gave her a dose of pain tea, along with an extra swig, because why not? And he walked over to the fire to check on the water's progress. Versa was sitting on a log near the flames while the soldiers finished eating. "How's Mrs. Rescatar doing?" she asked. "I didn't hear her scream. I was kind of expecting that." Young Pear squatted next to her. "She passed out just at the thought of the setting, which made my job much easier. I think I did a fair job, too, but my cousin can fix her tomorrow if necessary." "Tomorrow?" Her voice was pitched higher than normal. "There's no way we can get them up tonight," he explained. "The sun will be going down soon, and that rock face is impossible in the dark. But we should be all right." He nodded to a security team and whispered, "We fed them, so they should be loyal as dogs. By morning, the soldiers will be rested, and the Rescatars will be stronger and better able to handle what's ahead of them. Mrs. Rescatar might be able to do the climb with some help, but we're going to have to carry Mr. Rescatar." Of course, Versa murmured. "Tomorrow morning will be better." She stared into the fire. "Hey," he gently shook her shoulder. "Something wrong?" She managed to smile. "No, nothing really. I'm just a little anxious, I guess." His eyebrows rose. "You anxious? The slashing sow?" he whispered mischievously. "I think you'd make a mountain lion nervous before he sent you running for cover." Her smile became wooden. "Silly, I know. Look, your water's boiling. Best get back to Mr. Rescatar. Do you need any help?" Young Pear used his sleeve to protect his hand while he grasped the handle. "No, I've got it, unless you want to help." "No, that's all right," she chuckled nervously. "I'd rather just stay by the fire and watch those little boys stare at the soldiers. Quite entertaining." Young Pear nodded, turned away, and missed seeing her wince and press her lips together. Poe Healy hadn't intended on leaving the barn ever, but the timid sergeant sidling up to the second resting station intrigued him. Suddenly he remembered where he knew him from. "Sergeant, where have you been? We sent you to check the other canyon at that first wall we came to days ago. Where's the rest of your men? Weren't there 14 with you?" The sergeant was shaking. "Sergeant Major, I have some unbelievable news, sir. I've just come from there." He gestured to the southernmost canyon in the west. "The soldiers told me this was the command center and Poe sighed, realizing getting to the unbelievable news from this jittery man might take some time. "Make your report to Thorne," he said shortly. "Sir, please come with me," the sergeant pleaded pitifully. I can't face another. Poe groaned with annoyance and took the man by the arm. He marched him up the front stairs and into the large gathering room. Thorne was gazing out the western windows, gesturing with some papers held in his left hand. "General, this is the man who left us at the first wall with 50 men and is finally here to make a report." Thorne didn't even glance at them. "Take it yourself, Healy." The sergeant cleared his throat. "I was specifically told to give the message to you, sir." That turned Thorne around. "And who told you that?" The sergeant glanced at the officers, now all watching him. "Sir, in private, please? I think you'd prefer that." Thorne threw down his papers and pointed to the study. The sergeant and Poe went in first, and Thorne slammed the door behind them. "You have 1 minute. What's this all-important message?" The sergeant tried to get to the point without dithering, but his eyes were full of terror. He said to not go to his mountain. There were Salemites there, everywhere." Thorne's eyes grew large. "Where?" The sergeant gestured to the direction of the canyon. "West, then up to the north. The canyon ends and there's this large valley, then a cliff. At the top of the cliff is this massive flat space, bordered by mountain peaks. Could hold tens of thousands of people. Several thousand were already there when we arrived." "We?" Poe said. "You and who else?" The sergeant looked down at his hands. "My 14 soldiers." "Where are they now?" "Dead, sir." "Dead?" Thorne repeated. "How?" "Killed by a man who took my sword." Thorne scoffed. Figures. The sergeant cleared his throat, still steadying his hands. He has a message, sir. Said to tell you that it was his mountain and his people, and that anyone who tries to go there will be killed. Thorne sniffed at that. Rather bold claim. He alone killed my soldiers, the sergeant said, looking up at Thorne. Behind him stood a line of young men taller and stronger than anything I had, armed with only sticks. They didn't even have to help the man. Poe was intrigued. Did this man identify himself? The sergeant hesitated before nodding. Thorne was losing patience. Well, who was it? Sergeant Major Shem Zenas. Neither Poe nor Thorne could move for nearly a minute, staring in disbelief. It was obvious why the sergeant struggled to relay his message. Finally, Thorne spoke. It's a lie. But the sergeant didn't seem to think so. The man must have been in his 60s, and he definitely knew how to handle a sword. Said Parenshin himself trained him. Poe covered his face with his hands. Here was proof, absolute proof, of his suspicions about Zenas. He did deliver Miss Murray to be executed last night. Poe would take no more. You said you killed him yourself, Lemuel. Shut up, Poe, Thorne shouted. He ran his hand roughly through his hair and turned to the sergeant. Did you speak to anyone? Tell anyone else about this imposter? The sergeant shook his head. No, not at all, sir. Because that's what he is, an imposter. Shem Zenas is dead. Thorne turned to his sergeant major. I guarantee that, Poe. Of course you do, General, Poe simpered back. Thorne glared at him. Poe glared back. He would not back down. Never again. Take him, Thorne said, gesturing to the sergeant. He's your new responsibility. See that he speaks to no one and that no one else hears about this imposter. Understood? Of course, General. He prodded the sergeant out the door, took his elbow, and directed him to the barn. He didn't release the man until they were in a quiet stall. Tell me, Poe asked in a low voice, was it really him? The sergeant shrugged. I never met him before, but I don't know how any other Salemite would have such ability. Poe shook his head, a lingering, or maybe hopeful, doubt remaining. They had lots of people infiltrating the world for many years. It could easily be someone else just pretending. Did he give you any other evidence of his identity? The sergeant thought about that. No, sir. He just felt powerful. Poe was afraid of that. Zenas always had a presence about him. But this sergeant, lost for days in unfamiliar land, was likely easily ruffled. Thorne's probably right. You were terrified by an imposter. But if you reveal what I'm about to tell you, I will deny it. After dark, you run away. Get as far away from here as possible and tell no one what you told me, all right? Otherwise, I have no doubt Thorne will be looking for you, and it won't be to give you a medal. Where should I go? Anywhere but here. And that, Phoebe, young Pear said to the rescatar's daughter as she hovered near him, is how we close a wound. He cut the string and readied the needle for the next stitch. It's really quite amazing, Phoebe said. Just like sewing cloth, but with oozing bits. Young Pear chuckled, but her father moaned. Pain? He asked. No, Mr. Rescatar said. Not from my belly, but from listening to my daughter. Really, Phoebe, I don't need descriptions right now. She smiled apologetically and squeezed her father's hand. Mrs. Rescatar leaned over from her prone position to watch the next stitch, the pain tea already making her more comfortable. You really seem to know what you're doing. I've seen it done a lot, experienced it myself on many occasions, young Pear explained, and I even practiced once on a real person. Mrs. Rescatar smiled. Who was the lucky victim? Young Pear swallowed and completed another stitch. My grandfather, General Shin, right before he passed. Mrs. Rescatar sighed. Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't realize. It's all right, he said, flashing a brief smile before beginning the next stitch. He said I did a good job. It just wasn't meant to be. Your family will be thrilled to see you, you know, Mrs. Rescatar assured him. I'm looking forward to watching their reaction when you come walking out of the woods to the sight. Lilla will most likely explode in joy. They'll hear her all the way in Edge. We'll see, was all he said. Young Pear, Mr. Rescatar whispered. Don't underestimate them. He examined the next stab wound. An hour later, Mrs. Rescatar was sitting up with her arm secured in the sling, and Mr. Rescatar's torso was carefully wrapped in bandages. Phoebe had the privilege of completing the last 3 stitches. Young Pear put away the medical supplies as Phoebe helped her mother over to the fire to get something to eat. Thank you again, Young Pear, Mr. Rescatar said as he checked one of the bandages. Without you, I'm not sure what condition our family would be in tonight. I hate to think about it now, but now I don't have to. Your parents will be very impressed. Young Pear smiled hesitantly. It's I who should thank you, Mr. Rescatar. I think they may be more willing to take me back if they see I've done some good along the way. After all this time, well, you just might be my way back home. No, Young Pear, you are your own way home. We'll see, he mumbled again. Your son said there are blankets at the emergency cave. I've sent a few men up there to get them. It's going to get cold tonight, and we need to keep you and your wife warm and rested. We should move you over to the fire before I put it out for the night. Beavid, Young Pear called him over. Give me a hand? Sure, Shin, you're finished? Good timing. You really should know that. Beavid's voice trailed off as he picked down to pick up Mr. Rescatar's feet. Young Pear picked him up under his arms, glad that the man was slender and lightweight. What, Beavid? He grunted as the 2 of them hefted Mr. Rescatar. You'll see in a moment, Beavid said, as they carried Mr. Rescatar to the fire. They gently laid him on the brush dirt, and Young Pear put the medical kit under Mr. Rescatar's head as a crude pillow. He stood back up. So, what should I know, Beavid? Beavid pointed at Versa. She was trembling as she sat by the fire. I'm so sorry, Young Pear, I'm so sorry. He hadn't noticed until then that the rest of his security team sat on the opposite side of the fire, twitching, bouncing their legs, massaging their hands, and watching her intently as if she might explode at any moment. Young Pear rushed over and kneeled in front of her. Sorry about what, Versa? What's wrong? You're shaking. Her face contorted, and she began to breathe heavily. Gripping his hand, she squeezed it as she tried to control her breathing. Oh, no, 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 Young Pear whispered in rhythm to her breathing. Stitches and broken bones were one thing, but this was nothing he'd ever experienced firsthand. Mrs. Rescatar was wincing in empathy. Those pains were only 2 minutes apart, Versa. Young Pear, better get that bag again. She said her waters gushed about half an hour ago. What? No, 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 Young Pear whispered again, taking Versa's hands in his. No, if you can wait until morning. Young Pear, Mrs. Rescatar exclaimed. The baby's coming now. 2 minutes apart, Mr. Rescatar said hoarsely. Get her to the logs, Phoebe. Take this bag here and start getting out whatever bandages are still clean. Young Pear stared at Versa as the pain faded. But you said I lied, she whimpered. Well, I didn't know, really. It was just back twinges, but then they kept coming. I felt the first twinge by the river this morning, but they were so far apart I was sure I had time. The midwife said first babies can take a whole day or even 2 to come. Her voice grew shriller and more panicked. And we would have been up there on the mountain by now. That's what you said, we'd be up there by now. And the pains really weren't noticeable until the last hour or 2, but you were right earlier when you were holding me. You felt my belly tighten, and Tears spilling down her cheeks startled young Per into action. He stood up and gently pulled her up, too. She was markedly different than the defiant, critical woman he'd spent the day with. He put a supporting arm around her and walked her gingerly to the logs, which would provide meager shelter. Mrs. Rescatar struggled to her feet with the aid of Louise, while Phoebe retrieved the bag from her father. "I thought you had a few more weeks," young Per said, as if that would change anything. "Well, it's all guesswork, isn't it?" she sobbed. "The midwife I saw last week said my body was preparing, but it could still be weeks. That's what she said, weeks or days, who knows. I didn't tell anyone, though. My mother would have never left me if she knew." Young Per laid her down as Phoebe joined them with the bag. Mrs. Rescatar sat clumsily down next to Versa as her son ran back to the safety of the fire. Young Per kneeled next to Versa on her other side. She was already breathing heavily again. "Versa, I don't know how to do this. I mean, I've helped Uncle Deck with the cattle on occasion and watched the barn cats give birth, but this—" Mrs. Rescatar put a steadying hand on Versa's shoulder as she breathed slowly through the next pain. "I've been through it 4 times and helped my sister twice. I can talk you both through this." She looked up at young Per. "She'll be all right. If she's been walking all day and having pains, then she's probably strong enough to do this." A quality in her voice did not sound as confident as her words. Salemites were terrible liars. "And so are you," she said to young Per. "This is what being a husband is all about." Young Per gulped as Versa gripped his hand for support. "But I'm not her husband," he whispered to Mrs. Rescatar. Her mouth formed a small, embarrassed O. "Oh, of course, I understand a bit about the ways of the world. Your father can have the privilege of fixing that up at the site tomorrow. What's important is that you're here for her and your baby." Young Per was shaking his head, partly because of what Mrs. Rescatar said, partly because of the ferocity with which Versa was squeezing his hand. "I'm not the father either," he whispered. Mrs. Rescatar's eyebrows furrowed. "You're not with her? I heard that many women followed their men here. I saw lots of them, so I assumed—" She babbled, searching the ground for the right thing to say and not finding it anywhere. "You two just seem so natural together, and despite what you said to those soldiers, I know she's not a Travato cousin." Versa cried out. "Something's happening." "I just met her this morning," young Per whispered in a panic. "Young Per, help me. I need to push." Don't. Pant through it," Mrs. Rescatar said, and panted herself to demonstrate. Phoebe, standing nearby, also panted as if it were a group activity. Young Per recoiled and watched as Versa panted until the pain subsided. Soon her fast breathing relaxed and she closed her eyes. "Well, young Per," Mrs. Rescatar said, looking at him with determination, "you're the only able-bodied person right now, and she obviously wants you to help her. Phoebe, help Versa with her breeches." "Whoa!" Young Per scrambled out of Versa's grip and shut his eyes. No. "Young Per," Versa pleaded as Phoebe helped her undress. "Please help me. Don't leave me. Don't be that breed. Please." "Come on, young Per. This is why you're here. This is the right thing to do. It's not inappropriate. This is necessary. Go on." The voice was clearly Mugga's. Pugga was probably sitting on the other side of the fire with the nervous soldiers, holding his head and rocking back and forth, as he always did when a woman in the family was having birthing pains. Young Per took a deep breath and crawled back to Versa, whose attire was now significantly altered. He focused only on her face and gripped her hand. I'm here. I won't leave you." To Mrs. Rescatar he said, "What do I do now?" She looked around urgently. "Oh, what's the best way to do this? No birthing stools, obviously. No place to hang a birthing rope. If we ask a couple more soldiers, we'll have enough help for the squatting position." No, Versa whimpered. "Only young Per." "That greatly limits your options, Versa," Mrs. Rescatar warned. "And I don't want anyone watching." Don't worry, young Pear grimaced. I can guarantee no one at the fire wants to witness this. He didn't add, myself included. Well, that leaves you lying on your back, Mrs. Rescatar fretted. Most difficult position for you. It's hardly ideal. Mama, Phoebe said timidly, nothing seems ideal right now. True, Mrs. Rescatar sighed and cradled her broken arm, looking around for a strategy. How best to do this? Dear Creator, we need ideas. Louise called from a safe distance. Mama, Papa says, try feet on chest. Young Pear frowned. How is she supposed to put her feet on her chest? Your chest, Mrs. Rescatar said. That's right. We did that with our last one when he was coming too fast, and it was just the two of us. It's harder on the mother, but easier on the catcher, so you can see what's going on. Young Pear's eyes bulged. Right there, Young Pear. Kneel in front of her. What? Versa cried out again. I need to push. Now, Mrs. Rescatar ordered. Young Pear scrambled to his position, and Versa firmly planted her bare feet on his chest. Young Pear went pale. Grab her arms, Mrs. Rescatar said, as Versa reached up to him. She braces her feet against you and pulls on your arms. Young Pear's mind went mercifully blank as he tried to focus on Versa's face, and she gripped her arms. Phoebe, Mrs. Rescatar pointed to her daughter, who looked desperate for some way to help. Support her from the back. Push her up to a sitting position. That's it. Now, Versa, push against the pressure. Young Pear closed his eyes and nearly lost his balance as Versa pushed against his chest and pulled on his arms with shocking strength. He was sure there would be bruises in the shape of feet on his chest later. Push, 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 push. Good. Don't forget to breathe. And push, push, push. Young Pear peeked briefly to see if it was over, but there was no baby yet by his knees. One more, Versa? Mrs. Rescatar asked. No, she gasped. Breathe slower, Versa. You can rest for a moment. Slower. Young Pear, Versa panted. What do you see? Nothing, he said, his eyes still closed. Well, look. No, Mrs. Rescatar chuckled. Versa, the head is very low down. You're doing wonderfully. This baby's been making her way down all afternoon, hasn't she? You're one tough mother. Tell us when you feel a pain again so we can support you. I think maybe 5 more cycles and you'll be a mama. 5 more? Young Pear whimpered. Hey, Versa snapped. I'm the one doing the work. I know, he assured her. He twisted his head and looked behind him. Where are they with the blankets? Oh, no, another one, Versa whispered. She took a deep breath as Young Pear closed his eyes again. That's it, Versa, Mrs. Rescatar encouraged, as Young Pear firmed his grip on her arms. Push, push, push. Pull on his arms to balance yourself. Remember to breathe. Keep going. Push, push, push. Young Pear couldn't squeeze his eyes shut any harder, but he tried. Versa's pushing and pulling on his body was a remarkably bizarre sensation, and he tried not to think what it was accomplishing. Versa suddenly released his arms. I can't, she panted. I'm too tired. Young Pear opened his eyes. Versa, there's no stopping now. He gestured to her lower half that he was ignoring. She shook her head in despair. I'm too tired, Young Pear. This day was just too much. I can't do it. I'm so weak. Tears leaked from her eyes and she moaned in pain. Mrs. Rescatar grabbed Young Pear's arm and whispered in his ear. She told me she walked 12 miles today. She shouldn't have. That's not my fault. I didn't know, he whispered frantically back. This just isn't the time or place, Versa announced, her chin trembling in panic. No midwives, the air's so cold, there might be other soldiers coming. So much can go wrong in the next few minutes. Her entire body began to shake in pain and terror. No, I'm just not going to do this right now, she declared, as if she were in control of anything. Young Pear's mouth dropped open at her misplaced determination. Mrs. Rescatar grabbed his arm again and whispered urgently in his ear. It's not uncommon for women to panic at some point in birthing, and she actually has plenty to worry about. This is hardly the best time or place, but young pair, there's no option. If she doesn't push, they'll both perish." Stunned at that news, young pair stared at Mrs. Rescatar. She nodded gravely. He licked his lips, took a deep breath, and it was necessary, he reminded himself, looked down. "Nope, I want to see this baby, Versa. So far, I see the top of her head. I think she has blonde hair, Versa. Nothing sadder than a bald baby, my Grandma Travata always says. But not this one. Come on, Versa. Let's see the rest of her. You can do this." He grabbed her arm and pulled her upright. But she was as floppy as a rag doll as she sobbed, her eyes still wide with worry. I can't. She shut her eyes, squeezing more tears down her pale cheeks. Young Pear held her up the best he could, but he had no idea what to say next. Her fear was beginning to transfer to him. The midwives had all kinds of strategies for dealing with every problem, but he knew very little beyond the basics. Before he could send up another prayer of pleading, he'd thought several in the past hour already, he heard a familiar voice in his mind, Mugga. Young Pear, appeal to her toughness. Get her angry. She's strongest when she's angry. Ursula Thorne, he barked. She opened her eyes and glared at him for using the full name she hated. The terror was gone, replaced by fury. You will get this baby out tonight, Young Pear commanded, or I will tell everyone on the mountain how you were too weak. It wasn't enough. She closed her eyes and sobbed again. But I am. Young Pear leaned over and held her face. No, you're not. He made you strong. He forced you to be tough. Her blue eyes opened again, and Young Pear saw she wanted to believe him. Now, let's get the ultimate revenge, Versa. Make Lemuel a grandfather, and to a girl. He couldn't tell if she was laughing or sobbing. She seemed to be doing both as she gasped. A new pain was coming. Young Pear resumed his position and gripped her arms. She put her feet back on his chest, partly hesitant, partly insistent. Come on, Versa. He still thinks he's a young man, but we both know better. His hair's going gray, and he does not like it. Versa took a deep breath and started to push. That's it. Make him suffer. Turn him into a grampy. He told me just last year he couldn't imagine becoming a grandfather for many more years. Well, let's imagine the look on his face when he push, hears he's old. She gasped, scoffed a laugh, and took another breath. Yes, keep going. You're doing it, Versa. He can't fight it. He can't win. He's not going to get me as a son, and instead you're going to make sure he becomes a grandfather to another girl. We can do this to him, Versa. Push. I see part of a face. It's all smushed up and wrinkled and looks like his scowl when the cooks made stew with carrots in it. Versa gasped a laugh and released his arms. Versa, don't quit, not now, Young Pear said, grabbing her arms again. Her face contorted with intense discomfort. Pain's faded. Have to wait for the next one, she panted. Young Pear looked at Mrs. Rescatar. This should be the last one, she assured him. You're both doing wonderfully. Young Pear grinned and hurriedly wrenched off his jacket. What are you doing? Versa gasped between breaths. No blankets yet. The baby needs to be wrapped up. In your uniform? What else? Ultimate insult, Young Pear declared. He gave me this when we were in pools. Versa smiled weakly, then took another breath. She put her bare feet back up on his chest, marking his thin graying undershirt with 2 dirt imprints. This is it, Versa. Young Pear took her arms again as she pulled and pushed. Go. She's coming. Remember, this is all his fault. You're stuck here in the trees, surrounded by soldiers, and with me as your midwife. Make him suffer, Versa. Do it. Versa peered at him through her squished face and took another breath. You've got it! Push, push, push! She's turning, Versa! There's a shoulder! Catch the baby! Mrs. Rescatar cried. Young Pear released Versa's arms and caught the baby as it slipped onto his jacket. He quickly wrapped it up as the newborn coughed and spluttered, and then, to Young Pear's enormous relief, cried out. Young Pear's face was so wet with worry he could barely focus on the baby he cradled. You did it, Versa! Did we get our revenge? She panted as Phoebe helped her lay down on the ground. Is it a girl? Young Pear opened his jacket and peeked. He started to laugh as worried tears finally released from his eyes. It's a girl! Take that, Grampy Thorn! Versa closed her eyes and laughed and cried in relief. The cord, Mrs. Rescatar reminded him. Lay the baby down, Young Pear. We need to tie off the cord. Her daughter was already handing him some string from the earlier stitching job. We need something to cut the cord with, she said, looking around. Young Pear laid the baby on the ground and pulled the long knife from his waistband. He showed it to Versa. She laughed softly. That's why I brought it. Phoebe, in my bag are baby blankets and changing cloths. Please bring them to Young Pear. How much did you bring? He asked, his hands fumbling with the string as he tried to tie off the cord of the squirming newborn. Mrs. Rescatar winced as he held the knife to the baby, his hand trembling. He sliced through the cord, and nothing else, successfully. Mrs. Rescatar relaxed only after he put the knife back into his waistband. The bag is mostly full, Versa said, trying to sit up a little to see her daughter. Young Pear now had the bag and was dumping out its contents. Yep, it's mostly changing cloths and blankets in here. You knew you'd deliver, didn't you? He said, quickly putting a changing cloth on the baby and swaddling her tightly in a soft cotton blanket. Versa nodded guiltily, her face wet with tears and perspiration. You're pretty good at that, she smiled. You'll have to teach me. I've never put a cloth on a baby before. Young Pear looked up at her. Really? She nodded sheepishly. Guess I better keep you around. You're proving to be rather handy. Setting arms, stitching wounds, now midwifery. I'll take care of the feeding lessons, though, Mrs. Rescatar suggested. Young Pear nodded vigorously in agreement and scooped up the baby. Using another cloth Mrs. Rescatar gave him, he wiped the newborn's face clean. We'll finish washing you when we have warm water again, he said softly to the crying baby. So, Versa strained to see her daughter. What does she look like? Young Pear sighed. He'd never understood before what people saw in newborns. He'd seen dozens, and they all looked misshapen and beat up. And a season later, they looked nothing as they had, which he always thought was fortunate. When someone in their family gave birth, he'd look at the newborn, shrug at it, then pass it along to the next family member waiting to hold it. But not today. His vision blurred as he gazed at the tiny baby, trying to open her eyes and twisting her neck. He instinctively kissed her cheek that was so soft, it felt almost as if it wasn't there. She's absolutely beautiful, Versa, just like you. Versa smiled as Young Pear scooted over to her. He laid the baby in her arms, and Versa kissed her head. She looked up at Young Pear with the softest eyes he'd ever seen. Thank you, she whispered. I'm glad you were the first man to hold her. I'd been hoping it'd be Guide Zenas, but given the circumstances, you're not a bad second choice. Startled, Young Pear sat back on his heels. The Salem birthing tradition. Men always held the babies first, grandfathers, uncles, husbands, to feel of their duty in protecting and guiding the child. And for practical reasons, too. Someone had to take care of the baby while they finished with the mother. He wasn't sure how to interpret what Versa said. But she was examining her newborn, smiling softly and steadying her face, so she missed Young Pear's rapid blinking. He was just turning to get up to leave her alone with her baby when he felt Mrs. Rescatar touch his arm. We need to finish up here, and I can't quite help her, but I'll tell you what to do. Young Pear nodded and got back into position. Shin, he heard Beavet call from the other side of the logs. Everything all right? We heard a baby crying. Young Pear nodded at Versa, but she didn't notice. She was smoothing her baby's matted hair and gently touching her nose. Young Pear felt a lump build in his throat, but he smiled as he watched her. Perfect, Beavid, he called back. It's a daughter. And that's the end of that rather long section, but I figured we have to have all of it in one reading, right? So that is the end of part 4 of 5 of chapter 6. Thank you.